Thank you, and thank you all. I love Angel conferences, so I'm very happy to be here once again. I'm glad that it can be happening in remote at the very least. We just had our state conference last week, and again, it was remote too. So we're living in that world, but it's working amazingly well. Sad not to be in person, but not too bad. Anyway, so welcome. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. I'll kind of pop in and out of my slides, and you'll get a copy. Definitely, Eric will have the slides, but I'll also give you a link by the end of today too, just because then you'll have it. Let's see if I do something. All right, so welcome. This session is on the 7 elements for highly effective. As I mentioned in the session before, originally this was created during our emergency remote time, but we've been thinking it through and figuring out how we feel like it still has a very, it's very important even now as we move to either hybrid or in person, or if you're still remote. I know in New York City, we have a lot of folks who are still remote. And yeah, I'll say more as we get through it. But anyway, so this is really a culmination of working with teachers as they moved into that emergency remote instruction and really thinking, observing classes, doing coaching, and kind of really trying to pull together what we observed and what we think are maybe helpful ways to think about how we actually do our instruction, and then how we bring technology into that. All right, let me. Okay, so my name is Nell Eckersley, and I work at the Literacy Assistance Center in New York City. We primarily do professional development for programs that are either funded by the city or the state. We also offer some public workshops, and we are at a lot of conferences. So I have several colleagues you might have met elsewhere. Cynthia Bell is our math person, and I know she's presented here as well. Liz Elena is our literacy and science person. And then we have Will, who's our ESL person, and Judy Trupin, also our ESL person. So we do a lot of PD, and our contracts generally mean that we do some really extended and like I said, coaching and deeper professional development. So my area has long time been technology, and before pandemic times, that was a bit of a, you know, there were certain people who are very interested in that, and then there were a lot of people who were like, I don't have access to any technology in my classroom. My students need to learn to read before they can get on a computer. You know, a lot of reasons, and technology breaks, which is true, right? So I don't trust it. I don't want to rely on it. I'm much happier with my pieces of paper and whatever. So then pandemic happened, and suddenly everyone had to figure out, how do I take what I did in person and do something like that, you know, virtually. And so we saw a lot of even our own practice as as professional developers, where we had historically met in person, and now we were doing our professional development online. We watched ourselves and how nervous and weird it was to shift into this new world and not have that in-person interaction, and, you know, putting people in groups and, you know, moving around the room. And then here we were in Zoom, and how do we make it work? And then we made it work, and we got better and better at it. And I think that's what I've seen in all the observations I've done in classrooms. So we're going to talk a little bit about instructional routines and learning goals, which Priyanka brought, you know, when she showed you the app that they had created. That, I think this term routines, it's interesting. So Cynthia Bell, as I mentioned earlier, is one of my colleagues, and she's a math specialist, and they talk about routines a lot in math. But I think in instruction in general, as teachers, many of us have routines, right? We know that if we're going to introduce new vocabulary, or we're going to begin reading a book together or something like that, we have a few different techniques that we use to do that. And we decide we're going to do this one or this one, but we kind of have some set things we do. Every now and then we throw something new in, but we have these instructional routines. Do those instructional routines have a tech component to them? Do you think about what you're doing when you have your instructional routines? Are they based on really what you want the student to be able to do? Or is it more, you know, your method? So this is an opportunity to kind of review that and think through that a little bit. And then we're going to think about how that fits into these 7 elements. And the elements really are the kind of buckets of how we teach. And then one of the things about the 7 elements that I did a presentation at COABE, the national conference, and I had a big turnout. And what I've seen often when I do this workshop is that people are very hungry for the tools, right? So we're going to talk about the elements, which are these buckets like assessment or interactivity. But what are the tools? What are the tech tools? And everybody's very hungry for the tech tools. And we are very careful when we do this presentation to kind of talk a lot about the thinking and the planning and the why you're doing it before we get to the tools, because the tools are so exciting that often we just want to run to the tool and use it without necessarily spending a lot of time on, is this actually the right tool? Does it actually lead to the thing I want to have happen? So we will talk about tools, but it will be at the end. So again, this is taking us through memory lane, right? This was, again, we'll have a little survey in a moment, so I'll find out from you guys where you are in your teaching world at this point. But this was a typical in-person classroom in New York City at a community-based organization. Teacher in the room, things around on the walls, maybe a whiteboard or chalkboard or a projector or something that would allow the teacher to show things, some space where the students could move around maybe. And yeah, lots of posters and things on the wall to kind of remind people of vocabulary and things like that. Then we moved to our emergency remote instruction. This is a class I observed where the teacher was working with students on note taking. And so she took a photograph of her notes and put it up there. And then students had to kind of figure out what did her shorthand mean. And then it was a very good lesson on note taking. But I thought it was really interesting how she used, really a live photo that she just took and put it up on her screen, and then had students talking at the same time. So a very interactive lesson. And then opportunities for students to move into breakout rooms. So again, that ability for students to have opportunities to collaborate with each other. And now we're kind of in this, maybe you're in this hybrid HyFlix blended world where you're either maybe teaching. I've observed some classes in New York City where the teacher has both got some folks in the room and some folks on Zoom. It's complicated and hard. COABE, again, they had some hybrid sessions. It was really interesting to see the complexities of that. Sometimes it really works, sometimes it's really, really hard. And then this isn't really showing that version, but the version where you maybe are still mostly having your in-person class, but you also are making sure that content is available online. And so there's, either flipped classroom or other ways that information is moving that's different than what happened before pandemic. So this is us thinking, wondering, contemplating, how are we going to do this? Like what is going to be our new world? In New York State, there's a little bit of a fantasy that we're going to go back to a world before pandemic, and it's just going to be the same as it was before we ever knew about COVID. I think if you talk to programs and students and teachers, that's not going to be what happens. That students have found some value in being able to attend class online. Teachers have figured out some ways that it's worked for them. At the same time, we've lost some students who couldn't participate, and we want to be able to, give them services. So we want to have some in person at the same time, social distancing, vaccine, masking, lots and lots of things. And for us, transportation in New York City too has become people are nervous. And anyway, so there's a lot of things going on that are going to make this world not go back to before pandemic, but going to be a new world. And so trying to plan for that and make the best version we can is kind of our job now. So I am going to ask you to take a little survey. This is going to take you through basically where you are now in your practice. Are you online, in person, or somewhere in between? And then it's going to move you through, ask you a few questions about what you do. So which tool do you use for online video platform that you use? So go ahead, I'm going to stop. Let me see here. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'm going to put this link in the chat. maybe you were all really brilliant and were able to scan that QR code. I'll put it back up in a moment. Oh, I see people shared things. And yes, I'm sorry, I didn't even give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Absolutely introduce yourselves in the chat. And yes, that version of hybrid does look very expensive. Okay, so I put the survey in the chat. I'm going to bring the screen back up again so we can, in case it's easier for you to scan the QR code and do it on your phone. We're using Mentimeter, which I really like. I still haven't used it in all the versions. I've seen people do some really exciting things with Mentimeter, but in this case, we're just doing a survey. But what's nice about Mentimeter, let me escape out of this view and take us to this, is that it does give you the live, you can see the responses live. Let me take us all the way back to the beginning of it. Oh, maybe it didn't give you that one. All right, we'll come back to that one. I added a slide and I think it didn't give you that option. Did it only let you see the last slide? Oh, tech. Well, here we go. So you saw that one. Let me go back, take us back to the first one. There we go. So on this one, we're asking you if you're teaching online, or if you're doing a combination, maybe with the same class or maybe in different classes, and then teaching in person. Yeah, so it looks like very few people are back in person. So inside your Mentimeter, you should be able to move to different slides. I know it's a little confusing. Fantastic. All right, so we had a lot of people doing both, which I think is probably the way it's going to be. All right, I'm going to move us along, but we'll come back and look at the slide in a moment. We had, what platform or tool do you use for your students to access your instructional materials, assignments, and activities, right? So maybe before pandemic, maybe you use something electronic, but most teachers I don't think were. And it's interesting to see what you're using now and maybe what you might be considering using even as you start to move back in person. And we have a lot of other. So those of you who are putting in other, please share those in the chat. It's always good to know about these different tools folks are using. But Google Classroom is really standing out there. Does someone who's using Google Classroom want to unmute and say, like, is this because your program required it? Is it something you as an individual decided you really wanted to do? I'm not sure how New Jersey does it. Or you can put it in the chat too. So definitely Google Classroom and other are our two big buckets there. So again, I hope you're putting in the chat if you're doing other, and maybe in the chat you can put whether if you're using Google Classroom, if that's because you personally liked it or was something that your program required or got you all set up on.
Now it looks like some of the other is Edmodo.
Oh, excellent. That's very exciting. Okay, great.
My computer just for
And then the next question, which maybe you couldn't get to, how do you incorporate interactivity and collaboration? There we go. So again, we only gave you limited options here, and you might be doing other again. If you have other, please, again, put it in the chat because we all want to know what you're doing. And again, this was created when we were online, and it looks like most of you were either online or online and a little bit in person. So maybe it's changing as you move to in person, but so definitely add your other into the chat. So other's big in this one. Okay. Oh, I'm excited to see what the chat has for that one. I'll come back to it. And yeah, Eric, if you want to shout out when you see a majority or
Schoology.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
used to use Schoology, some more Edmodo.
Okay.
Yeah. Nobody on Padlet.
I
like
love
Padlet.
Padlet. We're going to do a Padlet today.
Yeah.
We'll see how you feel about Padlet. In fact, our illustration today is a Padlet. Okay, I'm going to move along. When you teach online, what whiteboard, if any, do you use? So we have the whiteboard that's in the conference, video conferencing platform like Zoom, or we have Jamboard. Oh, I see a lot of Jamboard people, I'm guessing. I've definitely seen teachers using an actual physical whiteboard behind them. And I've seen teachers do the piece of paper too. And maybe you don't use a whiteboard, but looks like the one inside the platform is very popular. But we do have a few people using the real one. I love that. All right, I'm going to take us through to the next slide. So how do you assess learner understanding? And our experience has been that assessment really took a little bit of a dive during pandemic, which is understandable, right? We just wanted to, we always want to stay connected and you know, be together and get some learning done, but the assessment piece was tricky. And in New York City, or actually in New York State, we were not, the state funded programs were not allowed to do online assessment for pre and post testing. So we realized a lot of teachers just rely on that pre and post testing. They don't necessarily build a lot of assessment into their instruction. And you know, we see the value in both the summative and the formative assessment, but people don't necessarily think about it. So I'm really impressed to see how many of you folks are doing that. And this is exactly right. There's so many different ways to do assessment, but assessment is so important, not only because it tells you where everyone is, but it actually can indicate to the learner where we're going, right? That this is the information that's important. And so that's the part you can hold on to. So this is exciting. So worksheets that are submitted, asking if everyone understands, right? Like a check-in, and then others, very big here. So please do put that into the chat, what you have been doing for assessment. And that is our Mentimeter. So I will give you a link to those results, so you'll have that. Let me get out of the main view. Put this in our chat. All right, so that should be everything, I think. Did I just give you the link to the same thing again? Maybe I did. All right, that's the link to the results. So thank you for participating. And if you haven't finished, you're welcome to continue. We'll look back at that again later. You all have access to it. All right, so that gives me a sense of where you are. And I think it keeps us in the same place. It keeps us kind of where I thought we would be, which is the fact that we're all over. We're all over the place. We're doing everything. And that many of us are still in the remote world, which, like I said, I feel like our funders don't necessarily understand, but we are dealing with the reality of that in the classroom. So these are the 7 elements. And we also have these 3 practices. So the 7 elements, again, came from observing what teachers were doing and thinking about what we did in the in-person classroom and how we were trying to translate that over, or how we were maybe even benefiting from the online space to go deeper, right? So we had the learning management system, which I don't know if you saw the photo that was in the survey, but you know, filing cabinet, I mean, pre-pandemic times, that was a filing cabinet, maybe some folders, handing out pieces of paper. The student needed to have a folder maybe, or some way to hold other pieces of paper. And now we were using things like Google Classroom, but Padlet or a website, there can be many different versions of learning management systems. So it can be the full bells and whistles kind of platform like Google Classroom, where you can accept homework back in and you can set scheduled assignments and things like that. Or it really can just be a single place online that students can come back to find the work they missed, or the work that's coming up, or a video that you want them to see, or whatever. So there's, by learning management system, we're using that kind of loosely, but it is this idea of how can the student access the content outside of the physical classroom. Video conferencing platform for remote instruction, obviously taking the place of being the in-person part when we're physically in a room together. And a lot of different tools I think have been used there, but we see the predominant one that people like is Zoom. For a variety of reasons, I think, but people are definitely using different platforms there, and they have different elements to them themselves. So then another element that we think is very important is interactivity. And again, early days, we saw a lot of teacher talking, you know, students were there, teacher was talking, maybe the chat was used, but it was very scary to let people unmute maybe. And now we're probably pretty comfortable with it. I feel like I see people who have to run meetings who are very like, okay, everyone stay on mute. But teachers, I see are very practiced in like handling we're gonna be not muted. If you have some background sounds, or like Susan, I can hear your background sound, please mute yourself. But like it's much more natural now. So interactivity on various levels beyond just unmuting, but creating opportunities in a remote instructional situation where students are really interacting with each other and with you. Feedback. So feedback beyond just assessment, right? So how are you getting information back? I've heard a lot from teachers on this one where, maybe students are sending in their writing, but how does a teacher get that writing, get the feedback onto the writing and get it back to the student if the student is just using a phone, right? So we've had to come up with some really creative ways. People are taking photographs. I know there are a variety of ways we're doing that, but we recognize that feedback's a very, very important piece, and maybe really developing some tools. I've seen teachers begin to use things like making little videos where they send them to their students, so the students get kind of that audio visual feedback, but it's personalized. So going deeper with feedback. Content, right? So you teach ESL, or you teach high school equivalency, or you're teaching basic education, or you're teaching science, right? So that content area, we have some tools that are specific to those content areas, but we also are building that ourselves. And again, I've seen a lot of teachers using the textbooks that have been made sort of electronic, but a lot of people using Google Slides, right, to make slide presentations that take the class through whatever the instructional purpose is. So there are images there, and then maybe there's a place where the teacher can add the responses from students and things like that. So figuring out ways to share the actual content with students from a distance. Whiteboard, we think, is really useful, right? We are used to having some place in our in-person space where we can write things, or we can put them on the wall at least. And so the whiteboard that we're using now electronically has some real perks to it, right? The students can often access the whiteboard after they leave the room, or leave the Zoom, I should say, or leave the online class, where in the in-person classroom, often that was all material that was left in the room, that was on a physical whiteboard and not something that they could take with them. Maybe they took a photo at the end of the class or something like that. So there's some places, I think, where the electronic version of the whiteboard has actually been a real value, a real plus, if you're feeling comfortable with it, right? And Jamboards are really interesting because people are doing things with Jamboards that they would never have done on, or would have had to do very differently on a regular in-person whiteboard on the wall. And then the last one is assessment. And again, just being aware that maybe that's, again, when I've done this versions of this workshop with folks, assessment you guys were actually very high there. Although some of your assessment was just asking folks how they're doing, but or that they got it all. But it really has been, I think, the one thing that kind of fell off the table, and it's understandable, but we do need to bring it back. And there's some really fun, easy ways to bring it in. So thinking about it that way. So we're going to do today. So as was mentioned by Priyanka, this is the EdTech Integration Strategy Toolkit, right? And she was talking about it from the digital skills piece. So you can see this is what the app looks like once you go inside it. She showed you the home page. So there's home, there's routines, EdTech tools, and digital skills. And they're still building it out. So when you go in here, you won't always find lots and lots of stuff in the area that you're particularly interested in. But what really seemed, for me, really gelled with this concept of our 7 elements was this idea of routines, and that how we developed the 7 elements was really thinking through some of the routines we'd had as teachers in the classroom, or that people were used to doing. So, I'm used to writing on the whiteboard. Well, that's a routine. That how, this is how I share new information. I put it on the board. Or how do I test students' knowledge? They come up to the board and they write on the board, or something like that. So thinking about some of the routines we have, and then seeing how those fit into those 7 elements, and then thinking about the technology tools, right? So it's kind of that thought process, and it's sort of a reiterative process where you have to kind of move around a little bit and then maybe come back. Maybe the tool you tried didn't quite get you there. I do a lot of presentations to groups of people who I don't have your contact information. So if I want to give you my slides, how do I do that, right? I have to think through that a little bit, and I have to think about you, I have to think about me, I have to think about the the place we're in. Are we in a room together? Are we online? That's going to tell me some things that help me know what tool to use. So that's kind of where we're getting to with the tool comes at the end after you've done all this other thinking. But this is a great resource. And I think they've broken the routines into these 5 buckets. I don't know that I find buckets harder. I want some explicit, like list it all out. And so if I think about, for example, I think I give us the question here. If you think, and again, I'm not sure how many of you are ESL or ABE, but you all at some point are introducing new vocabulary, and you're all probably at some point reviewing vocabulary. How do you do that? Is it accurate to say that you have a couple of different methods? You know, maybe you have a place where students all read a paragraph and underline what they don't know, or you introduce the vocabulary beforehand because you write it on the board. So in the chat, just either, you can answer either of these or both of them, but what are some ways, and again, indicate if it's remote or in person or blended, what are some ways that you do this? And it's sort of your go-to. Every now and then you do something different for sure, but are there some basic techniques you have? And we'll say techniques, but I think we're basically saying routines here. And then we're gonna keep that in our minds when we go back to look at the elements and the tools, because that how do we translate that? And think a little bit about how it changed for you. Did it change when you went from being in person and then thinking about how to do it in remote world? What tools did you end up using in the remote times? So please share all of that in the chat. I'm going to step out. I'll take us off sharing in a moment. We can look at the chat a little bit more deeply, but I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to type that in. And this is basically another review of the 7 elements. We saw those already. I don't know why I put the slide here, just to remind us that these are the 7 elements, because I'm really happy. I'm using my Bitmojis a little bit here. So this slide is to remind us about what I said earlier about tools, right? So we are very attracted to things that make us go, wow. I don't know how many of you, when you first used a QR code, for example, either making your own QR code or scanning a QR code, and it was like, oh my goodness, this is so exciting. I love QR codes, and I used to teach teachers how to make their own, and I definitely had teachers when they learned how to do it who went like, oh my gosh, it's so exciting. And they were going to make QR codes everywhere, do QR codes everything. And then they probably realized that that doesn't really work, right? QR codes have a very specific purpose, and they're really amazing for that thing, which is to get everyone to a place at the same time. But it doesn't work if you don't have internet. It might be easier to send an email to someone instead of sending them a QR code. You know, so again, this tools are so exciting, and I love that energy around them. But it's a reminder to ourselves sometimes that we don't need to use a tool right now. We can just take a photo of what I did today and put it up on a slide and share it with people. That's how wow we can get. But there are other times when the bells and whistles are really important. I'm going to take this moment to stop sharing, and let's look at the chat. Ooh, excellent. You guys are really sharing lots, so this is great. Right, so I see some real explicit routines here, right? So I'm seeing the spelling the words properly on the whiteboard, and then discussing the meanings of the words and maybe synonyms. Ooh, someone's talking about word up. That's exciting. So I don't know word up. Is that must be is that a tool? Is that a digital tool? Yes. Okay. I love the polls in Zoom. That's a great way to get some information back, and it's anonymous, so you get people feeling a little bit more comfortable maybe to share information. So in the hybrid approach, someone projects the vocabulary list and sharing prior knowledge, right? That's wonderful. Yep, Google Slides for vocab would pick some words, and how great students can come back to those slides and review their vocabulary that way. Oh, someone else is using Word Up. Or is that that's Kathy? Maybe she mentioned it earlier.
One thing that I use, but that I didn't put in the chat, is I'll have like somebody else had mentioned this, using just my own Word program and sharing the screen, and then being able to highlight words as students are reading it to identify words that we probably need to spend more time on, you know, introducing it in that way.
Yes. crossword puzzles. Fantastic. So lots and lots of ideas there. So again, you recognize that in your teaching, you have some techniques and some routines that you use. And when you shifted from being in person to remote, there was some shift that happened for you. Either you really tried to replicate, or you maybe really did have the ability and fortune to find a technology tool that spoke to you and helped you with that. So maybe it shifted. So that's, I think, one of the concerns we have now, as I've said already several times, and I think you're all living, is how do we go forward from here? And so as we start to go back to in-person instruction or hybrid instruction, how do we bring the tech with us and the things that worked really well for us while we were in the emergency remote instruction? How do we keep the pieces that really did work for us? And this is, again, in the reflection on the 7 elements, that's kind of the underpinning of that. Like, how did I do that? Do I like it? Do I want to do it a different way?
I just want to now, before you move on, I just wanted to add one thing, which is that I'm not sure that everybody's always aware that you can save chats when you're in Zoom. So if a lot of this information in the chat is interesting to you, in the chat area, there's like the 3 dots. You can click on that and then save the chat. So there's, so you can do that whenever you want, like during the session, if there's particular things that were happening that way. So oftentimes people after it are over, like, oh, there was good information in the chat. Yes, you can save it yourself. You can download it when you're in a Zoom call and people are using chat.
Yeah, so I took a little screenshot because that's one of the funniest things about Zooming is I cannot show you what I do to Zoom, but I can take a screenshot. So let me share my screen again.
So the question, so Lori, the question, whenever you save it, it has whatever up to date there, right? So so you want to save it at the very end, right? But you can also save it as you're going through and get, to that point.
Sorry, that was not my slides. Let me get you to the slides, but I did add that to the slides. So yeah, at the very bottom of the chat panel, you'll see who can see your message and everyone, and then it's this little thing over here where you get to save your chats. And as I said, it saves it up to that moment. So you might end up with several different saves if you're nervous. All right, so now I want to learn, and you've already shared a lot, but I want to learn a little bit more, or we want everyone to be able to see your teaching practice, right? So we're going to look at each element, and you're going to think about which tools you use. So this is an opportunity to share resources, right? So several people mentioned, I'm going to forget the name now, but there was a vocabulary tool that sounds like you used. Are you happy with the tool that you're using? Are there pieces to the tool that are annoying or missing? And are there things you would like to be able to do differently? And that's a lot. You can pick out of those 3 things kind of what you're going to really focus on, because there are 7 elements. And then at the last column, there's a place for resources, which I will add some more resources there. But if they don't fit under these other columns, you're welcome to add resources over there. So this is a Padlet. And this is how you get to our Padlet. So I'm going to put that in the chat. So that's our Padlet. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I came to Padlets because I would do workshops where we would use chart paper and people would write lots of amazing, amazing things on the wall. And then they would leave and I would have all that paper. And so not only did they leave without that information, unless they took photos of it, but I was now tasked with typing all that up, and that would take a long time probably. So it would take like, a month before they would get that information. If we could do it on Padlet, they left with the information, right? They have that at any time. They can come back to that Padlet at any time. So then the big question was, do they know how to get back to the Padlet? And that is a big question, right? So when you leave today, will you be able to get back to this Padlet? what are some techniques that we could work on to help you to know that you know how to save the link somewhere, or you have your own Padlet account and you've opened it and now this will save inside your Padlet account. So those are things that I wrestle with a lot, and coming up with solutions takes many steps, right? The Padlet was not my first thought. At COA, when we were doing these hybrid workshops where there was someone, there were people in the room and there were people on Zoom, how could we have them work together? Padlet worked really well for us that way, right? There could still be groups on Zoom and breakout rooms, and they put their content into a Padlet, but then the people in the room could also work in groups, but have at least one person entering their information on a Padlet, and everyone could see it. So Padlets for us became very, very, very valuable. And many of my colleagues have moved off. They started using Jamboard and other tools for some of the things that we were doing in Padlet. Some of them have come back because Padlet just does have so much. It's once you get over those first hurdles of how to use it, it really has a very rich and broad functions, and you kind of come up with new ways to use them. So I'm going to go actually out to our Padlet and see what's going on there. Oops. Oh,
well, I think now this underscores your your initial point, right? Which is that you choose the tool that's most appropriate to the task that you have at hand, right? And so there's times when Padlet is really perfect, and there's times when maybe a Google Jamboard is, but Google Jamboard is really difficult to write in some way, right? And so if you're trying to capture a lot of information easily, Padlet's probably more preferable. But I've done projects on Jamboard where I've had students like design a town, right? Like, what do you want in town? A library, a school, like a recreation center for my children, right? That's easier on a Jamboard than it is on Padlet. Right. So depending upon the activity, you're going to choose the Padlet.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. And so what I want for you guys now is, if you're in the Padlet, to go under each of those column headers. So learning management system, what have you been doing there? So the questions are, you can ignore we already kind of talked about whether you're in person or hybrid, but what tools are you using? So under the learning management system, I know you already told me many of you were using Google Classroom. So this is a little reiteration of the Mentimeter, but just go ahead and say if you're happy with it, because that's actually really important, right? Learning management systems historically, I used to go to a conference that was a distance teaching and learning at a university level, and every year there was a new learning management system that all the universities were buying, and all the teachers hated it. And they were never part of the decision making of whether that was the tool to have, but it was sort of like, well, Harvard's using this one, we better use it. So learning management systems is a really, you need to feel comfortable with it for it to work. And then your students need to be able to access it. So knowing if they're coming to it on their phones, or if they actually have access to computers, all those things can help you decide which learning management system. And you'll notice that you also can go back and read other people's posts here and vote up and down. So it's helpful for us to know, like, you're like, oh yeah, ×2 on that one. So the first column is the instructions. Second column is the learning management system. Then we had the video conferencing platform. How are you doing interactivity? What are some techniques you have? What are some electronic tools you're using there? Some digital tools. Feedback. How do you provide feedback? Again, I've just been reading a lot. We just did a session yesterday on using video, and there's a lot of studies out there that talk about how effective it is to give, like I said, short little video feedback, which I don't think we ever think to do. And it feels very major, like you're doing something really major, but once you start doing it, it's so easy. Like a little phone video or a little Zoom recording that you then send to the person. So thinking about feedback is for me a new area that I really want to dig into. So we have interactivity, we have feedback, we have content. Are there tools you found that are so wonderful or really frustrating to teach your content? If you're a math teacher, that math, all the different symbols and things, those are software packages you can get. Have you found things that you like? Is anyone using Desmos? I have to say that because Cynthia, as I said, my colleague who's the math person, Desmos is amazing. And a lot of people don't know about that. So I'll add it if no one else says it under content. But if you're teaching English, if you're teaching social studies, if you're teaching, whatever you're teaching, content-wise, where are you finding that content electronically? Are you making your own slides? Are you pulling things together, or a website. And then the whiteboard, Jamboard obviously is one that people are kind of really getting more comfortable with. I know the Zoom one has just changed a little bit, so that maybe has given you some more reasons to use the Zoom one. But there are other tools out there that you can use as a sort of whiteboard. I could even claim that Padlet could technically be a whiteboard on some level. And then assessment. And we're going to actually have a Google form today because it's a great way to get a lot of information from people that's easy to use on a phone. It's easy to use on a computer, so everyone has the same access. Excellent. So you guys are really populating this. This is fantastic. So again, if you keep adding to this, you can come back to it, but this is going to be a really rich resource. Saving the chat's fantastic, but hopefully this has kind of brought some of the chat content over to a more permanent place, or ongoing up. Ooh, and we got a GIF here. Nice. And this is always the exciting part for me, when people are, those of you who know that you are the one who will go and try something new. So with Padlet, you really can insert a lot of interesting information in your posts. So I love it when people add images or photos there.
Now, the other nice thing about Padlet is not only does it capture the information like from a meeting, but because it's more or less permanent, you can have students go back to it over the course of a couple of weeks and continue to add information. And so it becomes a place not only to capture discussions, but for discussions to continue to evolve and, and grow.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, homework can be done on here. Like I said, some people I know have used this as their learning management system. So and this is a particular layout. If you're familiar with Padlet, there are different layouts you can use, but this layout allows you to have all these different columns that move independently. So some teachers I've seen have used this. So each column is actually a class meeting, and under that there's all the different homework, and then maybe there's interaction from the students, or maybe this is links out to even other Padlets. So yes, Padlet is sort of fantastic. Okay, so very impressive, right? I'm seeing a lot of the things that we've talked about. And if you put in some stuff under interactivity, I'd love to know how you're using it. So you're welcome to go back in and edit your posts, or if you haven't posted already, just say how. It's very interesting to think about how do we use this tool for interactive work. But excellent. And if you have questions, maybe you are trying out one of these elements, but you haven't found the tool that you like. So feel free to put questions in the column as well, because maybe there's someone here who can have suggestions for you. All right, I'm going to continue on. So really just to reiterate that when we are developing our lesson, right, the goal here is what will the student learn, and what do we want the student to be able to do by the end of the lesson. And then backing out from that is the work that we're doing, right? So how are we teaching should really connect with what we want the students to be able to do. And this is the thing with tech, is that sometimes I feel like tech is just used because we're supposed to use it, or again, maybe you're required to use something, but really thinking about what it will do to the lesson. How does it make learning actually happen better, deeper, more? I'm taking a class this summer on sailing, and the first class we met and we were watching a guy on a small sailboat do the rigging, and a woman who'd taken the class a year or so ago kind of walked behind us and whispered, I made a video of this when I saw it. So several of us pulled out our cameras and made videos, and I saw some people made their videos in portrait mode and some people did it in landscape. And then I took my video and put it onto YouTube because I don't have room to hold that video. So I put it on YouTube, and now I can watch that video again. And reviewing what I saw in person again on my video was so valuable for my learning. And it really made me think about suggesting at times for students to think about making videos of things that they're actually seeing the first time, but now they can review it. Or maybe one student does, or maybe one teacher does, but providing recording and video after the fact to review something that you already did in person. I hadn't really felt in my own experience how very, very valuable that can be. Again, only for certain things. I don't know that I would record a lecture, but this how-to with a very physical piece was really valuable. And again, I hadn't experienced it before, so it was really good to experience it. So again, identifying your learning goals, those may be already given to you, you already know kind of where you're going, but then thinking about the elements that support those goals, and then thinking about the tools. And so again, to kind of reiterate that one more time, if we're thinking about our ed tech tools, we start with the people. That's you, that's your students. Are your students accessing this in person? Is it a hybrid situation? Do they have phones? Or are they accessing on a computer? All of those things will tell you a little bit about what you need to consider when you're thinking about your tech tool. Objective, what is it that you actually want to have done? You know, that the teacher who hand wrote notes and then took a photo of it, that's a completely wonderful way to teach note taking. She could have done it using a Google Doc, but I think seeing the handwriting was actually really valuable. Most of the time for many people, most people are gonna take notes by hand probably. And then strategies, how do you get to your objective? And this was something you did before ed tech, before remote maybe. So now we have the new situation. Now you're on Zoom. How are you going to get to that objective? And then we think about the technology. And then again, it's a bit of a reiterative process, but the key here is the technology comes after all that other thinking. Now, digital skills are an interesting component to this, right? So I'm hearing from a lot of teachers, a lot of interest and concern about how do we teach digital literacy while I'm teaching ESL or while I'm teaching science. And that kind of comes into this place too, right? So how do I, if I'm going to make a decision that normally I used to teach, we would do this, we would read this book together or these chapters of this book together, and students would then write a book report. Do I want to take time? Do I have time to move that onto something where they're typing out on a computer? And we're going to really spend some time on spell check and all the other kind of formatting pieces? Or is it more important just to get the writing out? There are times when we need to take that extra piece of time to include the digital skill. And the digital skills are things like creation. I mean, it doesn't have to be like these very firm things like keyboarding. Video, again, like maybe the report is now a video. But there's a lot of writing that leads to the video, right? So the student has to write an outline. They still have to read the book. They have to do an outline. They have conversations with a partner about what are the main points, who are the different characters. There's a really clear rubric for the video, but then they make a video. They might spend more time on the video than they would have spent on writing a book review, but they still had to do the writing. Because I know we need the writing for their high school equivalency test or whatever. So it's a lot of juggling. And I know everyone's kind of exhausted and it's hard to think of one more thing to bring in, but that is the place we're at. And I think we've all seen, and as Priyanka talked about, I mean, this is the world we're living in where people are being left out of the world that's moving forward because they can't access, they don't have the skills or practice skills on top of not having hardware and not having internet. So digital literacy really is the area that we can really contribute to. So that comes in here too, in the strategy, in the technology, and then the kind of circling back and having a set of digital skills that you want your students to have. So teaching students how to attach their homework to an email. I've heard from a lot of teachers, students don't use email. They want you to send it to them in WhatsApp, fine, but how do you attach? Right? That practice is huge. Or where did it go? I've downloaded things on my phone and I never know where they are. So learning where they are, right? That's a huge set of skills that for students in their everyday life is going to be really valuable. All right, soapbox there. I do have to go to slideshow mode for the next one because behind the green, this is Wizard of Oz, right? So this is the wizard behind the screen. So now's a moment to take back and actually look at what we did today with each other. So I've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but when I was getting ready for the session today, I knew that one of my objectives was to leave you with my slides, was to get my materials to you so that all these links in here and reminders and stuff you would have access to before you left today. How do I do that? So what do I know? So the people, well, I'm guessing you're on a computer or a phone because we're meeting in this virtual world. And I also know we're going to be on Zoom. So what do I know about Zoom? I have the chat. So that would be one way to share content with you. I know you're going to see something visually, but you might not have a big screen. So you might be able to use a QR code. I don't know. So I have to think a little bit about that. So my main strategy here is to share a link somehow. And if I had your email addresses, I can send it to Eric, right? And Eric can share it with you, but you won't get it immediately. I want you to get it immediately. So I had to think through all of those things. If we were in person, I might have given you a paper handout, maybe the QR code, maybe I could email you. I've already kind of said, well, I can't do those things. The Zoom chat probably is the simplest, but I'm also concerned that if I give it to you in the Zoom chat and you don't know how to save the chat and you don't click on it, you won't get the link. Google Slides, Google Docs, making it available to you online immediately versus having it be in PowerPoint where I'd have to upload it somewhere and give you a link to it that way. Google Classroom, which is really complex. I don't think I need to create a Google Classroom for us today. So you can see, right? All these are different tools that I contemplated. And at the end of the day, I did just make a bit.ly link. So I'm going to escape for 1 second. Let me do this. So that's the one difficulty I have when it goes to full screen is I can never get to my little notepad where I save all my links. But these are our slides. So I'm going to copy and paste that. And you'll notice, so one of my concerns is that if I give you a really long link, you might never be able to get back to it, right? So here, I made it into a bit.ly link. A bit.ly is like, you know, it's a shortener. It allows me to make it short. I usually make it into something that's words and numbers that make sense. So this is today's date, right? So NJOL and today's date. So if I asked you to type that in now, you might have some trouble with the bit.ly / and then knowing that NJOL has to be all caps. So those are the struggles. But now you might even be able to type that in, even if you couldn't just click on it. So that's been my process, right? To come, I can share a link with you. So I want my slides to be electronic or in the cloud. And I want to make the link something that you can kind of recognize the logic of in case you have to type it somewhere. But hopefully you can just click on it. And then in a workshop, we would even spend some time about you adding a shortcut or knowing where those slides now sat in your Google account so that you could get back to them. Because early days, I would just share Google links all the time. And people would leave the session and have to be like, I don't know how to get back to that link. You know, I don't know, could you email it to me? And then they'll keep getting back to it through the email rather than I made a shortcut and I put it in my NJOL folder that I know I can get back to whenever I want to. So that becomes part of the technique that I needed to work on every time I did a workshop. And we have like 2 more minutes. So any questions from you? That really is the majority of what I had to say today. There is a little quiz, which is my assessment. And then at the very end, we were just going to look at how many of the elements did we actually use in today's workshop, which we tried to use all of them. We sometimes use the same tool for multiple purposes, but we kind of covered all the different elements in the session today. So you'll see that in the slides. And I will add to the chat just now the quiz in case you want to take that. And then, yeah, any questions you have?
Again, rendered mute. Mind's blown. So for folks that in the chat, there's questions about the PD certificate. I've put the link in there to the survey. If you attended a session and didn't click the link, you need to send me an email to the NJOL account. So which I'll put it in here again. I'm closing the surveys after the end of each session. So if for some reason you didn't sign up, you can just send me an email to the NJOL Gmail account. Okay.
And one last thing, in the slides also, there is a website that we're building on all of these elements and things like that. So you're welcome. You'll see the link in the slides. And you know, I'm very excited. If you want to ever give me feedback or ask questions, we're building this and we really want to make it fit all the pieces that are out there. So any questions or comments or observations are very, very welcome.
Okay. Not to go back to the PD thing, when you sign the form, it doesn't generate it automatically. I download that information and I'll be sending them out. So if you don't anticipate getting the PD certificate like 5 minutes after you fill out the form, it's a way for us to collect the information and then for me to send it out. Right. And if you missed one, yeah, you need to send an email. So yeah, thanks now for again, I think that I understand I want the tools, right? But if you're not choosing tools mindfully or thoughtfully, right, then you're going to end up painting yourself into a corner, and having to kind of reconfigure things. Better.
Right. And for students, it's also frustrating, right? When it's not like obvious why we're doing this extra thing. And I'm sure we've all had those experiences in the world where it's like, really, you're going to make me do it this way when there's so many better ways to do it. And so that's part of our responsibility, is to make the experience of learning exciting, and then the tool that they're learning have some function in their life. That's another piece I use in my head of like, is this should I take the time out to show you where your Google folder is? Yes, because that will be really valuable in your life. So yeah.
And I put it in the chat. When I go to a restaurant now and they want me to scan a QR code to get a menu, I'm just like, just give me the damn menu. Like, why do I have to get my phone out, call it up on a QR code? Like, just.
But worse than that, they've done this, but they make the menus tiny on the phone. So, okay, fine, I'll scan the QR code and not have you don't have to have menus for me, but then make it big on my phone. I'm going to be looking at it on my phone. And they make tiny menus. So another lesson, if you want to make it mobile friendly, it has to be good on a small screen. And if you're going to use a QR code, you're probably using your phone. So make it big. There's no reason for it to be.
They did the QR thing because of COVID, right? So that no one's touching the stuff and.
Yes, although we all have learned that touching the stuff is not kind of how you get it. But yes, that's where it started. And it really has meant that people have really leapt into the QR code world. But again, often without thinking about what is the actual experience and why are we doing it.
Yeah. Put it up, put the menu on the wall.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they have digital ones now on the screen. A big one.
Well, that's good. Those are good places. They should get an extra star on their Yelp.
There's a store in Boston called Clover, and they've got on their big LED menu, they do a lot of like vegan and stuff like that, and so it'll say what they have still in stock and what's vegan, what's not vegan, what's gluten-free, what's dairy-free, and it's really easy to access in that way. So.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Right. So to repeat, so if you want the PD certificate for a previous session, you got to send an email to the NGL account. I can't send the link to individual people. Not my day job. I can't. Send it to NGL and we'll try to kick you up with the certificates. All right. So, all right. Thanks again now for another informative session.
Pleasure. And great to see you all, and happiness and